Thanks for joining us for another edition of our weekly Socialist Revolution broadcast. In the last few weeks, we have received hundreds of messages from socialists in cities across the country saying they want to get involved in the fight for revolution and expressing a revolutionary mood and, above all, a desire for ideas. We see an interest in Marxist ideas, in revolutionary theory and strategy, in Bolshevism, in a clear perspective on how we can actually achieve a transformation of society in our lifetimes. And this is all a reflection of the period that we're living in. One of the most important aspects of this emerging socialist movement has been a growing debate about what the goals of the socialist movement should be and what socialists should be doing in order to achieve them. And that's precisely why we're putting on these weekly live streams, as well as Socialist Revolution podcast, which you can follow on all major platforms. And with that in mind, in the interest of the growing debate and political clarity, we're doing something a little different tonight. We have something special for our viewers, a segment from a debate that was held in 2018 between Bhaskar Sankara, the editor of Jacobin magazine, and John Peterson, the editor of Socialist Revolution. It was a wide-ranging debate about the future of the socialist movement in the U.S. Tonight, we're going to run just the first segment of it, taking up the question of what is socialism. And in the course of the exchange, the two panelists go into a number of other topics: the Marxist analysis of the state, the question of bourgeois democracy. And I think that our viewers will agree that it's an opportunity to contrast, the two publications, but it's above all what we're seeing is two examples of different outlooks, different methods, and different programs that are being proposed as a way forward for the growing movement. And so these are all essential questions for socialists to be considering given the period that we're living in. So with that said, we hope you enjoy.
Socialism is a very broad definition. So I often think of it like a kind of a rectangle and a square thing. I'm older than many of you in this room, so it's been a very long time since I learned this rule. But a square is a rectangle, yes, but not all rectangles are squares. So in the same way, we could say that socialism came out of a workers' movement that went in many different branches. So when someone says, "Oh, well, Sweden isn't socialism," I would say it doesn't fit my vision of socialism, even Sweden in the mid-70s. But if someone wants to say that branch of social democracy is a form of socialism, I think that would be the same. I think that would be broadly acceptable. If someone were to say, the Soviet Union was not socialist, I would say, well, no, it is a form of socialism. It's particularly authoritarian. It wasn't a very good form of socialism, but it was a form of socialism. I would say broadly, but not one that I agree with. Otherwise, I think we fall in the trap of the annoying thing the libertarians do, which is say, this isn't capitalism. I believe in capitalism. This isn't capitalism. This is a corporatocracy or whatever they want to say. Right? They're constantly inventing kind of terms like that. Fundamentally, socialism, to me, is about extending democracy from the purely formal political sphere, of course, fighting for political rights, extending it into social and economic spheres. We want a world in which life outcomes aren't accidents of birth, where everybody can live in a basic degree of dignity, but most importantly, a world without exploitation of person by person. So fundamentally, that means a world where some people are not destined to submit themselves to the domination of other people in order to survive. So this is the fundamental goal of socialism. It's not the idea of a worker state isn't the goal. The goal is a society in which there's no more classes. There's no bosses and workers. There's just the emancipated people. And what that means in practice and how we get there is up to debate. But I think those broad sketches is kind of my vision of socialism, a world without exploitation and a world without oppression.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, no, I'm very happy to be here at Temple. Happy to see everybody out tonight in this inclement weather. And I think there's a lot, obviously, that we agree on. And so it's really great to be able to put forward, I would say different views on what socialism is. I think that the question of the kinds of reforms that we want to win, the kind of changes that we want for human society, a life without exploitation, a life of genuine dignity, a world where everybody can reach their full potential. The real question is how can we achieve that? And I would agree that a workers' state isn't necessarily the end goal, but I would argue that you need a workers' state, and the end of the capitalist state, the end of the bourgeois state, as Marxists would call it, in order to begin the process of dismantling classes, the process of dismantling the state itself, the process of getting rid of money, of the withering away of religion, etc. So I would say that socialism actually begins where capitalism ends. A lot of people would, in fact, call Scandinavia socialist, and obviously, as you said, there was some pretty terrific reforms that were won by the labor movement in that part of the world in the post-war period. In the 1970s, the social welfare state was pretty sweet for a lot of people, and yet you still had the domination of the economy by the capitalists. You still had the domination of the state by the capitalists, and you still had a world in which people were being exploited. And so the question is, if we're going to move beyond that, how do we get there? And so I would define socialism as a transitional period, frankly, between capitalism and the stateless, moneyless, religionless world that many people call communism. Obviously, there's also a lot of people that would associate the word communism with Stalinism, with the Soviet Union, and so on. But if you look at the original writings of the scientific socialists, and I think it's important for us as socialists to approach society in a scientific way, to have clear definitions and not have a mishmash of what things may mean. And to clarify that, if you look at that, then socialism, like I said, it's that transitional period between capitalism and a new form of society. So yes, we need reforms within this system. Yes, we fight for reforms within capitalism, but that's not the goal in itself. That's just a means to an end towards raising working class understanding of the need for a socialist revolution. So that's what I would argue.
Thank you. Any further thoughts on what John said, Bhaskar, regarding?
Yeah, I would say that I agree with the vast majority of it, and that I think the goal has to be a socialism after capitalism, not just doses of socialism within it. I would say where I do differentiate it is that since the subject was brought up, I'm not a communist in my vision of the future, in that I think, in other words, the vision of a withering away of the state is a goal, is an aspiration, is a horizon. I don't see it practically working, just in the sense of, let's say if me and you want to cross a river in a social society, and the primary contradiction, the contradiction of class, has already been overcome. But for a variety of reasons, I want to build a bridge and you want to build a tunnel. How do we mediate our difference? How do we incorporate others into this decision-making thing? How are resources allocated? How are all these things going on? I think a state is still involved. Now, if you are asking me whether I think there'll be a state that'll be mustering a standing army or throwing people into prison for years and years, or doing all of the sorts of things that the state does today, I would say no, absolutely not. But I think that there has to be some sort of way to mediate that difference. And I would just say in general, the reason why we can't just stop at vision, because there's much in our visions that we would agree with each other on. But the reason why socialism and the Marxist variety became the dominant part of the vision of the workers' movement in the late 1800s, because it offered three things. So it offered, one, the critique of the world as it actually is, basically saying capitalism is a system based on exploitation and inequality. So that was the first thing it offered. And to be honest, anarchists and others offered it just as well as socialists. The second thing it offered was a vision of a world after capitalism. So in other words, you have the critique, now you're saying, but it can be better. Because otherwise it's just religion, unless you could actually say it can be better. But that's also something that anarchists and other tendencies in the movement, or even the utopian socialists, were able to offer a vision of a better world. But the third thing was a pathway. How do we get from the really bad present to the better society we want to see. And the dominant parts of the workers' movement offered a vision of the struggle for reforms, but the way in which the struggle for reforms would embolden and empower workers to be able to demand more and to be in a structural position to build something better. And it's that road, it's that transition of how you build power and how you transform power that Marxists of all stripes were able to offer more credibly than others. And I think that's the real point of contention. What's our vision of how we get from the present that we agree is terrible to the mutually desirable future in which we might have, let's say, 20% disagreement between us, but compared to the rest of society, like 1%, I think that's a real crux of any disagreement we're going to have. It's not going to be over, visions of socialism. I think a lot of these things would just come down to semantics otherwise.
Yeah, that's a good lead into our next question. But the question of the state was brought up, and I think that's a good sort of point of differentiation. And when we're talking about what socialism is, I'm interested briefly, John, in the
question of the state, I think that's crucial. Engels, when he talked about the withering away of the state, he said that society, we basically have the administration of things. And I think that by definition, a state implies a class differentiation in society. It implies the presence of exploitation, the existence of oppression. And if as you said, if we get to this point where we're trying to decide whether we have a bridge or a tunnel, and we already have no more classes, then what we'd be talking about is no longer a state in the scientific Marxist definition of what a state is. As you said, no bodies of armed men. That would be standing above society. Excuse me?
So that's Weberian, not Marxist, though. But
that's what?
It's an armed bodies of men. That's a Weberian concept of the state, though.
Sure. Okay. But Engels also defined the state as armed bodies of men, as force standing above society that impose the will of a minority. Because the capitalist class is a small group of people, they need this overwhelming force in order to cow the majority into submission. Obviously, they use other things, not just brute force. They use tradition, they use religion, they use the media, they use everything else to try to keep the social inertia going forward. But I would say that's a big difference. So the workers' state is also transitional, and that's the question: what kind of state do you need when you have a majority of the population now administering things that only need to keep a small minority of people who want to go back to the good old days of capitalism? It's very, very different from the kind of state that we have today. But I do believe, I would argue that the state as such can eventually wither away when there is no need for compulsion, no need to force anybody to do anything. And I'd be curious, I don't know if we'll have time because there's other stuff, but when you said that the dominant part of the workers' movement, I'd be curious, in the late 1800s, what, who you would argue that was exactly.
So I think there's two different parts of the state question. One in which we would actually agree in that my conception of the state is kind of the instrumental conception of this. The state today is not a state we could just capture. It has to be transformed radically. It has to be, in the old language, smashed, because it's, the state has a class bias. It's a capitalist state. And I think that's something that differentiates us from a lot of social democrats, even a lot of people who describe themselves as democratic socialists. So I think we agree with the state now. I think and some of what you said is kind of in Lenin's conception of the state and revolution. And his logic was a simple logic, and not in a bad way. It's a simple logic in that, what he was saying was that today the state is a vehicle of bloody coercion. The worker state won't be, because the state today oversees the exploitation and oppression of the majority, whereas we'll just need the state to control a tiny minority. And I think in theory that made sense, but in practice we needed a more complex view of what does a socialist state actually look like? What does the transition state actually look like? What does socialist jurisprudence look like? Is there such a thing? There was early experiments in thinking along those lines in the early Soviet Union, and partially because they were in the middle of civil war and violence, they weren't able to really flesh it out. But it was our mistake that we haven't really made up for. So I think we need a better sense of what this state and what this different world would look like. And I would actually argue that doses of like liberalism, even in our view. In other words, I think we shouldn't tell people that we're starting from year zero. We should say what we don't like and what we like about the current state of things. So, for example, there's a bedrock of individual rights that don't facilitate the exploitation of other people, but just merely say, this is the right of the individual. This is where I'm away from the state, a right to basic freedom of expression and things like that. And I think given the experience of history, we have to be, very, very clear about. That's one reason. I'm not saying you're not presenting it, but in general, I think socialists need a different view about what our actual state would look like and what politics would look like under socialism, especially because I know this isn't the line of your organization, but most socialist organizations throughout its history, most Leninist organizations have basically adopted the view of a party state, right? They haven't said that socialism is going to be multi-party democracies and things like that. And I think just in the same way as we don't have planter parties today arguing for a return of slavery, you could say that under socialism, we can't have parties advocating for wage labor or so on. But I think we just have to be clear about these things and flesh it out, which obviously we don't have time for today.
Any thoughts on those words by Mr. Sankara before we move on to the next question, which I think is
I thought that
we're already heading towards, aren't we?
Yeah, no, I thought that was very, very, very good and clarifying. I mean, the idea that the state apparatus can't be taken over ready-made by the working class because it's the bourgeois state, capitalist state, is a state that's been designed for the rule of a minority over a majority. So obviously, we agree on that. And Lenin in State and Revolution, obviously, he built on what Engels had written and Marx had written in relation to things like the Paris Commune and things like that. But I think, and of course, the problem with the Soviet Union is that the Soviet Union was trying to hold out basically for the German Revolution. They were holding out for the world revolution. They never had any intention, Lenin and Trotsky or the Bolsheviks, when they first, the working class took power, of trying to build socialism in one country. That's an aberration that came up later under Stalin. But they did, of course, had to try to, from a very backwards basis, economically, politically, the cultural level of the population, illiteracy, things like that. They had to start from that very backward basis to try to build up ultimately the basic forms of socialism on a backwards material basis. And that's what led to a lot of distortions and problems in that society. As far as liberalism being a part of socialism, I would actually draw a pretty clear line and disagree with that. Liberalism is a form of capitalism. It's liberal democracy is a form of bourgeois rule. It's in fact a form of bourgeois state. I think the main difference between the vision of liberty of Marxists, of revolutionary socialists, and liberals is liberals in favor of equality of property rights, and socialists, revolutionary socialists, were in favor of equality of life, economic equality, social equality, political equality, and so on. And so absolutely, we wouldn't start from year zero. We would start from year 2018 if we succeed in bringing about the socialist revolution by the end of the year. I doubt that's going to happen, but obviously we're going to start with what capitalism leaves us. And of course, a lot of the political gains that were made by liberalism at a time when the capitalist class was a progressive force in history, we will be building on in a sense. But I think that socialism will actually be a very clear break with liberalism. Although, of course, I would agree. Yeah, I'm personally, as a member of the IMT, not in favor of having a one-party rule state like they had in the Soviet Union. All parties that don't take up arms, for example, against the workers' state agree to abide by the majority, just as we are told that we're abiding by the majority under bourgeois democracy today, would be allowed to express their views. If they want to, express, the idea that we should go back to the good old days of capitalism or to plantation slavery, they'd be free politically to do that. But I doubt they'd find many takers. So there'd be no need to repress them politically.
Well, I think I know we have to go on, but I think one important point of differentiation is that I don't think that there's such a thing as bourgeois democracy. And I don't think the democracy was a gain of bourgeois revolutions. Because if it was, it'd be a very strange bourgeoisie that gets credit for the thing they fought violently against. From the revolutions of 1848 onward, and the great surprise of Marx and Engels and the socialists of the day was that, in fact, the bourgeoisie didn't actually support democratization, didn't actually fight for any of these reforms. Up until 1918, 1919, when British troops were returning from the front, and a lot of them were ready to vote for the Labour Party, a sizable minority of them didn't even have the right to vote, even at that late stage. The fight in Sweden, it was among the more autarkic countries in Europe, just at the level of suffrage, in which full political suffrage wasn't run until well into the 20th century. So I think in all these cases, there wasn't a single time when the vote or something was just given from above. The closest you had to that was in the U.S., where there was white male suffrage earlier on, but that's an unusual state. So I think we should reject the notion of bourgeois democracy, but along with it, reject the notion that the bourgeoisie was ever progressive in a political way. They've learned to cope with democracy. And certainly we live in a capitalist society that has been tempered by democracy, in which democracy has been warped by the inequities of power that's inherent in a capitalist society. We don't live in a truly democratic society like we would want to, but I don't think any of those things came from the bourgeoisie. And when we say that the bourgeoisie was progressive, we only mean that in the sense that as an after effect of all the wealth that was created through capitalist exploitation, through the expansion of markets, that wealth has the productive forces of society, the economies of our societies have gotten more and more wealthy, which has created the possibilities for a different political form on top of it. But we're not talking about changes made in the political sphere, in which case capitalists have never once, in any instance, en masse, supported democratic reforms or democratic movements.
If I could just take 1 minute to just wrap up that last point.
Yeah.
Only to say that by the bourgeoisie being a progressive historical force, I am referring, of course, to the development of the means of production and laying the material foundations for socialism. I would say the bourgeois democracy is definitely a thing. I mean, we're in the city of Philadelphia. We're in the city of the Declaration of Independence and the American Revolution. But it's a question of democracy for who? When I say bourgeois democracy, I mean democracy for the bourgeois, just like in ancient Athens. Not everybody, they call it a democracy, but not everybody had the right to vote. It was only a small minority of people. And in this country, after the revolution, it was only a small minority of rich, white, male property owners who had the franchise. But I think that we would consider that, a form of democracy where decisions are made. But not very many people get a say in those decisions. Just like today, there's millions of people who are excluded because of because they're felons or whatever. You don't have real, genuine participation, even on the fictive, bourgeois basis.
That concludes tonight's segment of the debate. Stay tuned in the coming weeks for more on this exchange of ideas between Jacobin Magazine and Socialist Revolution. And if you want to follow more on our website, we recently published a balance sheet of the Sanders campaign, Bernie Sanders, and the lessons of the dirty break, making the case that instead of running as Democrats, socialists should be fighting for the creation of a mass socialist party for the working class. If you agree with the ideas we're putting forward, don't hesitate to get in touch. There's never been a better time to get organized. These ideas are finding an echo like never before, and our forces are growing. This is a great time for revolutionary Marxism. So join us in the fight for revolution in our lifetime.